Resuming debate, the honourable member for Vancouver Quadra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to join the debate on Bill C-51 today. Canadians are well aware of the harm that terrorism can cause and the fear that it can bring. And the overarching aim of terrorist activity is to instill fear and to divide us from one another and weaken our society. An important duty of Canadians, therefore, is to be vigilant against this divisiveness, as we will always be stronger when we're working together and united against acts of intimidation. In recent decades, particularly since the 2001 terrorist attacks in the United States, the global security landscape has undergone massive changes, in part due to the evolution of internet and electronic technologies. An important responsibility that falls on the government and parliamentarians is to improve our security system and framework so as to meet the challenges of our times in a manner that upholds our most cherished democratic values and principles. The Liberal Party and most Canadians recognize that our laws must adapt to reflect the changing global security landscape. And Bill C-51, the government's Anti-Terrorism Act, takes some productive steps to meet our collective security needs. One measure that this bill puts in place is to lower the evidentiary threshold for detaining a suspected terrorist. In fact, this measure, if it had been in place 6 months ago, may have prevented the tragic death of Quebec CAF member Patrice Vincent. His murderer was under surveillance and his passport was revoked in June of last year, but due to the lack of concrete evidence, he remained free. The bill also serves to put certain important programs, like Canada's no-fly list, on a firmer legal foundation. Better coordination of information sharing among Canada's many security departments and agencies is also a positive. However, there are deficiencies in this bill, many of which have been pointed out to me by constituents of Vancouver Quadra, and the Liberals have written amendments to address those weaknesses. The bill does not include the critical accountability that is provided by review and oversight mechanisms to ensure proper checks and balances to information sharing. And this is in fact one of the overarching areas for improvement to this legislation, which should be articulated through debate, expert testimony at committee, and which should have fair consideration of amendments. A bill of this importance deserves a proper, thorough, and non-partisan process. Bill C-51 is inadequate in other areas, particularly with regard to the far-reaching and vaguely articulated definition of national security, in terms of the lack of a sunset clause to provide Parliament an opportunity to quickly review and correct any negative consequences of the bill. And finally, there should be much more robust commitment to preventing the radicalization of Canadian young people in the first place by funding and working with their families and communities to that end, and strengthening our social safety net regarding mental illness. I'd like to talk a bit more about the need for greater oversight and review. As many of you know, last year I put forward my private member's bill C-622, the CSEC Accountability and Transparency Act. This bill proposed to modernize the framework for accountability and transparency for Canada's Signals Intelligence Agency, the Communications Security Establishment of Canada. It would have brought these 14-year-old laws governing this agency up to date to account for advances in internet and communications technologies, and it strengthened the mandate of the CSE Commissioner. Furthermore, 622 would have assigned a committee of parliamentarians with security clearance the responsibility to review and report on all of the intelligence and national security activities of our government. The very oversight that is being called for right across Canada by experts and non-experts alike. Despite widespread support from security, defense, and privacy experts and from opposition MPs, my bill unfortunately did not receive support from the government and was therefore defeated. But to put the need for this kind of parliamentary oversight and review mechanism into perspective, Ottawa-based journalist John Ivison has correctly pointed out that, and quote, Canada is the only country among our close allies that lacks a dedicated parliamentary committee with substantial powers of review over matters of national security and intelligence. He's right, and we should have one. Just as our security laws must be improved to meet the challenges today, so too must Canada's framework for transparency and privacy protection evolve in order to cope with the fast-paced changing technology. As journalist Glenn Greenwald noted in the Oscar-winning documentary, Oscar-winning as of last night, I quote, "When the rules that govern us are taken in secret, we lose the power to control and govern ourselves." And that is not what Canadians want. Federal and all our provincial privacy commissioners stated in a recent communique, quote, "Canadians both expect and are entitled to equal protection for their privacy and access rights and for their security. We must uphold these fundamental rights that lie at the heart of Canada's democracy." Well, how do our partners south of the border think about these things? One example is the United States Department of Homeland Security, in which this understanding of that balance is explicit. The department embeds and enforces privacy protections and transparency in all of their systems, programs, and activities, according to their privacy commissioner, which oversees a staff of 40 people in that department alone. In a recent speech, Homeland Security's Deputy Secretary Mayorkas confirmed that not only is this integral to the DHS mission and crucial to maintaining the public trust, it has resulted in Homeland Security becoming a stronger and more effective department. So if the government adopts the Liberal Party's reasonable amendments to create this balance, we can move beyond the dichotomized debate that pits security against Canadians' freedom and liberty. As it stands, Bill C-51 will give CSIS broad powers to disrupt not only real or perceived terrorist threats, but also threats that may undermine the economic or financial stability of Canada. This is too broad, Mr. Speaker, not just unnecessary for guarding against, and just not necessary for guarding against any legitimate risks and threats from terrorists. Also, it could be very harmful in further chilling important rights for citizens to have a voice and rights for civil society groups to disagree with government policies in a peaceful way. The Liberal Party will be proposing amendments to rein in and better define the vague and far-reaching new powers granted to CSIS in this bill. To assess Bill C-51's effectiveness in keeping Canadians safe and ensuring our freedoms and values are respected, a future Liberal government will require a review of the entire bill in 3 years to ensure any aspects that are unaccountable or harmful are quickly identified and fixed. In addition to granting CSIS greater powers, let's acknowledge that preventing individuals from becoming radicalized and falling into violent extremism in the first place is important and an effective second track towards reducing these incidences and the terrible harms they create. Let's not forget that several of the recent actual and planned terrorist attacks involved young men who were suffering from mental illness and addictions and turned to violence. Canadians experience a deep sorrow on behalf of the victims and their families. This situation is why the government must allocate more resources and be a partner, consulting with a variety of stakeholders, from police to social agencies, from families to religious leaders, and collaborate with developing community-based strategies to address radicalization at the outset or prevent radicalization. Improve support for those suffering from mental illness and addiction. And that's a commitment that the Liberal Party has made and will bring into our platform. Currently, through the work of local and provincial governments and community and religious leaders, friends and family members of the disaffected youth, there are a number of innovative models for supporting youth at risk and young men at risk, young women at risk, and lending them support and guidance. But more funding and more focus on this is needed, and the Liberal government would provide it. And as an aside, Mr. Speaker, I want to mention that supporting mental illness would have a great deal of benefit in a society aside from terrorist risks. Because let's not forget that over 3,000 men commit suicide every single year, many of them in their 20s, and most of them under the age of 45. The grief and sorrow that causes their families and our society could be significantly reduced with a greater emphasis on the second track, the track of prevention and support of those with mental illness challenges. So, Mr. Speaker, In 2001, in response to the September 11 attacks, the Liberal government introduced a number of anti-terrorism measures. We understood then, as we do today, that sometimes quick action is needed. We did, however, make sure there were full hearings, amendments were made, we heard from the public, we heard from Parliament and committees, and we also built in a sunset clause so that the bill could be corrected and be great legislation. We believe that's possible. This government has the choice to take that path rather than the path of unilaterally charging ahead. And we invite them to take our amendments seriously. If not, we will be campaigning on them. And if elected, we will be sure that they are put into effect to respect our most deeply prized democratic values. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.